If you've been in Antioch for very long, you know that there's a lot of trains and railroad tracks around our community. Have you ever wondered, if you get on a train here in Illinois, how do you know that the tracks are exactly the same when you get to, say, California? Well, of course, the reason is that there's a standard railroad gauge that establishes the width between two metal rails. It's been set by federal law to be 4 feet 8.5 inches. Now you might say, that's interesting, but why such an odd size? Well, the answer in short is that British expatriates were the ones who came and helped to design and construct the first railroad tracks in the United States, and they came and simply duplicated the way that the train tracks were built in Great Britain. You might say, okay, then why did the British choose such an odd size? Behind me now, you'll see a picture of ruts in stone roads in the ancient city of Pompeii. All the wagons had the same spacing, so the ruts were purposely cut to guide the wagons, particularly through difficult passageways. Guess how wide these ruts are? 4 feet 8.5 inches. You see, the Imperial Roman army had its war chariots, and they wanted them to be pulled by 2 horses, one for speed and second for intimidation. So the Roman engineers calculated that 4 feet 8.5 inches was the minimum wheel distance for 2 horses to pull a chariot side by side. So when the Romans ended up invading England, they brought with them their war chariots, and they created ruts in the roads of England. The Romans then eventually built roads in England so that they could get around the country. And then eventually the future British monarchs wanted to continue to use the roads that the Romans had built. And so therefore they adopted a standard wheel spacing for their wagons at 4 feet 8.5 inches. When England then built its first railroads, they relied on the craftsmen who built the wagons. And since they had already had the tools to construct the axle designs of the wagons at that distance, they then used the same measurement for the railroad tracks in England. So if you want to know why our railroad tracks in 2022 have the distance of 4 feet 8.5 inches, you have to go back to the ruts made in the ancient Roman roads some 2,000 years ago. Let me just take it one step further, just for fun. Behind me, you'll see a picture of the NASA Space Shuttle. The 2 white tubes on either side of the shuttle are the solid rocket boosters. They are responsible for bringing the primary thrust propulsion to help get the shuttle up and into orbit. Initially, NASA engineers designed them to be wider. Guess how wide they are? You see, the boosters were constructed by a firm in Utah. And since they weighed over 200,000 pounds apiece empty, the only way to get them from Utah to Florida was by train. And from Utah, the train had to go through mountain tunnels, and those mountain tunnels are only slightly wider than the railroad tracks. Therefore, the solid rocket boosters are 4 feet 8.5 inches wide. So the ruts made in the road 2,000 years ago are still shaping life here in the 21st century. Isn't that amazing? Habits, like ruts, have a way of shaping our lives and our futures. We're at the start of a new year where people talk about resolutions. But the reality is that we are formed much more by our habits than our hopes. Tom Brady, who's remarkably disciplined with his physical health, was asked one time about his incredible willpower. Where does it come from? He said this: habits eat willpower for breakfast. Justin Earley, who's an author, speaker, the one we're going to have out here in the month of March, in his book called The Common Rule, he writes this: if you want to get your hands on who you are becoming, you need to get your hands on your habits. All those who want to be attentive to who they are becoming must realize that formation begins with a framework of habits. For the next few months, that's what we're focusing on: habits. The habits that shape our lives and our homes, in hopes that our habits will be constructed in such a way that they shape our lives and homes to reflect the fact that we belong to Christ. Now, when I say the word habits, some of you say that sounds really dry and dull. It sounds like ruts of routine. But it can be much different than that. Bill ought to introduce the name of our series. It's called Grooves of Grace. Just as ruts were established in the roads in ancient Rome, and they're still forming and shaping things in our nation today, in a similar way, our habits that we put in place will shape our lives and our futures. And when they're chosen wisely, when they're chosen intentionally, they're not ruts of routine, but they're patterns and rhythms to our lives. They become avenues for the sustaining and transforming grace of God to flow into our lives. That's why it's called Grooves of Grace. 3 years ago, all of us had our normal routines disrupted, didn't we? And since that time, a lot of people have said, I feel so out of rhythm, out of sync. Nothing seemed right since then. And I think this is creating an opportunity then for all of us to say, what if I stepped back and rethought my habits and my routines and my rhythm? For 2,000 years, followers of Jesus have intentionally practiced certain habits. And to be honest with you, contemporary Christians, I say contemporary, I'm probably saying the last 30, 40, 50 years, contemporary Christians have gotten away from them. And many say because they're confining and they're boring. But when they are experienced and put into place in our lives, they're liberating and they're life-giving. So at the start of the new year, it's a great time for us to rethink our habits and our rhythms. And today we start with a very simple one, and it's the habit of stillness. Rhetorical question for you. How many of you have a steady and consistent practice of stillness in your life? This morning, we're going to look at a pretty pedestrian example from the life of Jesus. And if you look through the Gospels at all, you realize that this is not a one-time event, but this is an ongoing pattern in the life of Jesus. We're in Mark chapter 1, starting at verse 29. I'm just going to read the whole passage for you. After Jesus left the synagogue with James and John, they went to Simon and Andrew's house. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was sick in bed with a high fever. They told Jesus about her right away. So he went to her bedside, took her by the hand, and helped her sit up. Then the fever left her, and she prepared a meal for them. That evening after sunset, many sick and demon-possessed people were brought to Jesus. The whole town gathered at the door to watch. So Jesus healed many people who were sick with various diseases, and he cast out many demons. But because the demons knew who he was, he did not allow them to speak. Before daybreak the next morning, Jesus got up and went out to an isolated place to pray. Later, Simon and others went out to find him. When they found him, they said, "Everyone is looking for you." But Jesus replied, "We must go on to other towns as well, and I will preach to them too. That is why I came." So he traveled throughout the region of Galilee, preaching in the synagogues and casting out demons. So here's Jesus going over to Simon Peter's house, and it's not surprising that there are multiple generations of people living in the same house. What might be surprising to you is that it mentions Simon Peter's mother-in-law. What does that mean? Simon Peter was married. So the one that's kind of identified as the first pope of the Catholic Church is the only disciple that we have any evidence of that he was married. But he visits Peter's mother-in-law, Jesus does, and he heals her. And we don't know exactly what happened, but maybe Peter made the mistake of announcing the miracle on social media, because suddenly every sick, every injured, every demon-possessed person for miles around shows up at their door. So Jesus ministers to them. He heals those who are sick. He casts out the demons from those who are tormented. And then it says, the next morning, instead of getting a little extra sleep after being up late and ministering to people, it says instead of getting a little extra shut-eye, Jesus is the first one up before the birds, up before the dawn. And even though his body probably needed the physical rest, Jesus needed something more than that. Jesus shows us how to practice the habit of stillness. And I think as we're kind of going to unpack this a little bit, we're going to see that by practicing the habit of stillness, Jesus escaped certain things and he received certain things. Let's talk about what he escaped first. First thing he escaped was noise. It says, before daybreak the next morning. If you're a morning person, your hands just went up like this. Amen, hallelujah, right? Those of you who are not morning people are saying, hey, there is only 6 o'clock in my day, and that's at dinner time, right? But here's Jesus up early, right? I'm a morning person. I love those minutes in the early part of the day. When you're up that time, there's not a sound. Everything is silent and still. We have a clock on our mantle that you can hear ticking only first thing in the morning. And it usually drives me crazy, so I tuck it underneath the pillow because I can't stand listening to the ticking so loud. But you never hear it at any other time of the day, even if the TV's not on, even if there's nothing else going on, you can't hear it, but only in the stillness of the morning. But it doesn't take long for the silence of the morning to be broken, right? Cars driving, dogs barking, kids laughing, walking to the bus stop, sirens blaring, trains whistling. The silence is quickly gone. We have so much noise in our lives, don't we? Music, podcasts, television, smartphone notifications, on and on it goes, right? When was the last time you sat in silence? Silence is uncomfortable, isn't it? If I just sat here and we're quiet for a second, everybody get a little bit uncomfortable, right? Silence is uncomfortable. A lot of us fear silence. In this series, I want to give you some book recommendations. Tish Harrison Warren has written a book called Liturgy of the Ordinary. It's a good book on habits and spiritual practices. In the book, she cites a fascinating, but let me just say, disturbing University of Virginia study that said, given a choice, most people prefer being electrically shocked than sitting alone with their thoughts. That's crazy, right? But you think about it. You see somebody sitting in a doctor's office who doesn't have their phone. They don't know what to do. I have nothing to do. What am I supposed to do with myself, right? It's exactly why we need to be still, to escape noise, to break its grip on our lives. In the silence, we become aware of the inner dynamics that we avoid by keeping it noisy and keeping it busy. In silence, there's the potential to know what the psalmist says when he says, be still and know that I am God. There's the realization that as you reflect on that, it brings a certainty that the competing powers of sin and evil and culture, that our fears and that our anxieties don't really have the same grip on us when we sit in silence and stillness before our great God. So Jesus escaped the noise through stillness. What else did he escape? He escaped distraction. Jesus got up, left the house, and it said that he went out to an isolated place. The Greek word there for isolated is eremos, which means abandoned, empty, or desolate. So Jesus went to a spot where there was nothing to distract him. Do you have a barren, desolate spot where you can go to escape distraction? To-do lists, laundry baskets, text messages, kids pulling on your shirt tail, emails needing to be responded to. I mentioned Tish Harrison Warren. In her book, she says, my former morning routine was getting up in the morning and turning off the alarm of my cell phone, scrolling quickly through emails and news, and maybe glancing at social media for 5 to 10 minutes. And she said, over time, I realized I was imprinting my day. She said, just like a little baby animal, when it's born, the first thing that it sees, it's imprinted as being its mother. She said, my day was imprinted by picking up my phone for 5 or 10 minutes. And she said, it became impossible for me to clear my mind of the distractions. My day was imprinted with busyness and information and noise. You can see why living out these habits today is so incredibly countercultural. We need to recognize the power of culture and technology on our lives and realize we need these habits more than ever before. Let me say it a different way. We can't live like everybody else and expect to have different results in our lives. What are the habits of a genuine follower of Jesus? One of them is definitely stillness. And through that, it becomes a groove of grace for God to flow his sustaining and transforming power. The days of Jesus were nothing like ours. And yet still he understood just how important it was to have times of stillness. So through stillness, he removed noise and distraction. Another thing he removed himself from? Other voices. It's interesting. He goes away from the village. He's off by himself. The disciples hunt him down, and they tell him to come back. Say, you got to keep the show going. It says, everyone is looking for you. You're so popular, it's time to capitalize on this. Or maybe, hey, Jesus, there are so many other people here who still need you. You are obligated to meet the needs of these people who need you and want you. Well, Jesus goes to a desolate place, and he gets away from all the other voices for a while. Everyone had an agenda for him. Everyone had a well-meaning idea for what he should be doing. It was hard to get away from other voices. Do you have a hard time getting away from other voices? The voices can be other people. The voices can be social media or just the media. The voices can even be of good friends, and we just need to find a way to get quiet for a little bit. For me, I find I have a hard time getting away from a lot of voices, but one voice I sometimes need to get away from is other Christian leaders. I read books, I listen to podcasts, I receive a lot of good ideas into my life. But over time, I recognize I need to hear from God, and sometimes I need to get away from the other voices so I can hear his voice. Blaise Pascal once said, all of man's problems stem from his inability to sit quietly in a room alone. That's quite a statement, isn't it? All of man's problems stem from his inability to sit quietly alone in a room. We're afraid of silence. We've been taught to avoid boredom. We're told to, kind of get away from just being alone. But Jesus practiced the habit of stillness, even in the midst of his busy seasons. And I think by following him, he's calling us to free ourselves, to escape from the things that trap us and hold us. So Jesus practiced stillness and he escaped some things, but he also received some things. Let's look at what he received in the passage. Verse 39, I think, says that he received spiritual replenishment. Now, we know it was a long night of ministry because he gave so much of himself. It's probably fair to say he was probably exhausted physically and emotionally from ministering to all those people. But it also said that he was casting out demons, which means he was probably spiritually depleted as well. Now, you might be saying, but he's Jesus, right? I mean, that's no big deal for him. He just kind of flicked his wrist and all that stuff happened. But remember, Jesus was fully human. He voluntarily took on human weakness and human limitation. And in so doing, in his humanness, he showed us how to get refreshed physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And the busier Jesus got, the more time he spent in stillness. And what's the result of this time that he spent here? Well, verse 39 says that he went out to do more preaching and casting out demons. Notice it didn't say, so Jesus reluctantly dragged his weary body and his empty soul out to take care of people. It says he preached and he cast out demons. In other words, he went out with fresh spiritual vitality through stillness. His spirit was refreshed and replenished. For the last year or two, I think if you ask people how they're doing, once you get past good or fine, the most common answer you hear from people is tired. So many of us would say we're worn out, and for very good reason. But it feels like no amount of rest or vacation or abdication of responsibilities fixes it. Could it be that this is God saying we need to reestablish a habit of stillness in our lives? Escaping noise, distraction, other voices, meeting with God, hearing his voice. We can't do it on the run. You can't be still and kind of doing another activity at the same point in time. Stillness is what God has given to us to move us from tired to spiritual vitality. Do you have a practice of stillness in your life? Well, what else did Jesus receive from stillness? He received direction for his next steps. It's interesting. While he's in the desolate place, the disciples come and say, hey, everybody's looking for you. Where you been? These people love you, Jesus. Your approval ratings are off the charts. A few more healings and you'll own this town. Do you know how big that you could be? I mean, you're going to never have to buy another meal in this village for the rest of your life, right? That's what his friends wanted from him. That's what the crowd wanted. But notice, Jesus says, hey, thanks for that information, but we have to go on to other towns as well, and I'll preach to them. You'd be like, I'm sorry, what? There's a whole line of people here waiting for you. Why would you leave now? You're a rock star. Don't you love the adulation here? But in stillness, removed from the other voices, Jesus gets clear what the Father wanted for him for his next step. It's time to move on. Jesus had ministered to people. He had shared the good news. He had planted seeds. But now the Father was calling him to go to the neighboring towns. So many times I find myself asking, what's next? What's next in my life? What's next in my spiritual growth? What's next in our marriage? What's next for the ministry of Northbridge? When I was a hands-on dad, what's next for investing in the development of my son? And I ask those questions because usually I'm unsure. And when you're unsure, you become very vulnerable to the voices of everybody else, right? God can lead us through the counsel of others, but how do you know of all the voices which one is really God's idea for you? You got to be able to get quiet and still and sense where he's leading, sensing what's next. Right now, I think we are at a crucial time in our ministry here. After a few years of kind of languishing through pandemic issues, this ministry season has been a transition into a new reality. And now we're asking, what's next for Northbridge? Lord, where do you want to take us? I have a lot more questions than answers at this point, but I can just feel in my soul that God is calling us to some bold steps, some courageous actions in the days that are ahead. We have many wise and discerning leaders at Northbridge, and I've benefited so much from the counsel of our staff and elders and such. But we really need direction from God about what our next step or steps should be. Do you need direction for a next step in your life, in your career, in your relationships, in your spiritual growth, in your investment in your kids? Jesus modeled for us how to find it. It's through stillness, escaping the noise and the distraction, escaping all the other voices, escaping the agendas that everyone seems to have for us, and to discern, God, what do you really have for me? What's next? One more important thing I think Jesus received, it's in verse 38. We're going to finish that verse. It says, but Jesus replied, we must go on to the other towns as well, and I'll preach to them too. That is why I came. You know what else he received in the stillness? Jesus received clarity about his calling. And I've seen a familiar pattern play out here for years here at Northbridge. Somebody comes to our church, likes our church family, they're spiritually growing, they have a sense of joy, they have a heart to serve, they have gifts and talents, and they jump into a ministry, and they enjoy doing that. Then they see another one, they're like, oh, that one looks like a lot interesting too, so I'll jump in and get involved with that one. And they're in a small group, then they say, hey, would you be an apprentice leader and eventually become a leader of the group? And then they start seeing things that are happening in the community, ministering to special needs kids, helping in a food pantry, serving senior citizens, and they get involved in that one, and that one, and that one. And after a while, what happens? Burned out, overwhelmed, even angry and frustrated, saying, God, why'd you make me do all of this stuff? Or even sometimes to leaders of the church, why are you making me do all these things? And the question underneath that is, did God really want you to get involved in all of those things? Back in the summer, Michelle and I went on a retreat for ministry couples. Most all of the couples who were there were tired, burned out, and had completely lost joy in their ministry. For a week, we were forced to take extended times of stillness. I use the word forced intentionally there. I realized for me that while I've always had a disciplined, quiet time, I wasn't really in a habit of stillness. I was kind of accomplishing something as opposed to really sitting in stillness. So we had extended times of stillness. We were given a little journal with some scriptures to read and a few kind of reflection questions, but just trying to be still before the Lord. One day we were in a familiar passage from Matthew chapter 11. I'll put it on the screen here behind you. These are Jesus' words. Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly at heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. As I read that and reflected that day, I started thinking to myself, my soul has not been at rest for a long, long time. And I looked at that passage and I thought, the yoke of Jesus easy, his burden is light. Pfft, come on, right? It's not true. You know, a yoke is placed on the neck of oxen, right? Usually kind of connects two oxen together so they can work alongside of each other, work side by side. The yoke of Jesus means being connected to him, walking with him, doing life and ministry together with him. And Jesus said, that yoke is easy. It's not burdensome. So I reflected that day, then why does it feel so heavy? Why does it feel so burdensome? And in my reflection and stillness, I came up with two possible conclusions. One is that I'm carrying the yoke alone. I'm not leaning into Jesus. I'm not learning from him. I'm not walking with him. I'm trying to do something for Jesus rather than doing something with Jesus. Let me say that again. We a lot of times spend too much time trying to do something for Jesus than trying to do it with him. So maybe I'm carrying the yoke alone, but maybe another reason is that the yoke I'm carrying isn't his yoke. I'm carrying a burden that doesn't belong to me. Or maybe to say it another way, I've taken on someone else's calling. In the famous Old Testament story where David fights Goliath, he's getting ready to go out to battle, and King Saul puts his armor on David to protect him as he goes out. And David takes a couple of steps, and he sheds the armor, and he says, this wasn't meant for me. Saul, this is the way you fight. This is not the way that I fight. Too often, we fight using someone else's armor. We take on a yoke that wasn't meant for us. Jesus says, learn from me. Jesus had a regular habit of stillness. He had a rhythm to his life that involved regular times of stillness. Even in a demanding season of ministry, even though he was worn out physically and emotionally and spiritually, he leaned into his habit. And from it, he found spiritual replenishment. He found direction for what was next. And when his calling got a little fuzzy, he got clarity again about his calling and his mission. Michelle and I, while we were in Colorado, had a free afternoon to do some climbing, and I talked about that on Christmas Eve. We hiked up to 12,000-foot elevation and had this beautiful view. But on top of the mountain, I asked Michelle to take a picture of me to remind me of stillness. It also reminds me of Matthew 11, which says that when you're weary, you find rest by taking on the yoke of Jesus, doing life and ministry together with him. The Message paraphrase of this same passage I liked a lot, and so I made my own little meme in my own words, with my own picture, and hopefully you can read it. It says this. This is the same passage, but in the Message paraphrase. Are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you burned out on religion? Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. By coming to Jesus through the habit of stillness, we make a new rut. We make a groove of grace where he can flow a sustaining and transforming grace into our lives. And it will replenish us and allow us to live free and light. Do you know how desperate our world is to see people who live free and light? People who are unanxious, unangry, unfatigued, and instead are people of grace, peace, contentment, restedness, and true shalom. Perhaps the best way the gospel is going to advance in 2023 and in the years just ahead of us are when God's people live out the habits and rhythms of grace and reflect a life that is free and light. We start with stillness as our first habit. Next week, we go after the forgotten habit of Sabbath. I think it's going to be a good one. Let's stand for closing prayer. Just by way of reminder, if you're relatively new with us, me and our staff would love to have an opportunity to meet you. We're going to be back there in the back corner. Also, our prayer team is down front. Maybe just like to have some prayer about discerning about how to put some of these habits in place in your life. They would love to have the opportunity to do that. For our kind of closing prayer or benediction, I'm just going to use those words from Matthew 11 as a prayer over you. Just bow your head and let me just read Jesus' words to you. Are you tired? Are you worn out? Are you burned out on religion and religious activity? Come to Jesus. Get away with him, and you'll recover your life. He'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with him, work with him. Watch how he does it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. Jesus won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you, not anybody else's armor. So keep company with him, and you'll learn how to live freely and lightly. Lord, that is our prayer. Help us to live like Jesus. Help us to put his habits into practice in our lives, and may we know a life that is free and light. We ask that in the name of Jesus. Amen.